Right now, one of our fairly regular guests, Rabbi Didi Wax from the, if I mispronounce it, Shabbat up at Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. Did I slaughter that too badly? I get that pronunciation from Rick. It's his fault. But welcome, sir. It's a pleasure to have you here. Rick was telling me that you went to Israel over the summer.
Yes, I just want to correct. It's pronounced Chabad, but that's okay. That's yes.
There, see?
You have to have a Middle Eastern language to be able to say that. And we're actually part of the Chabad of Clinton, which is associated with the student group at Hamilton College, which is called the Chabad Student Group at Hamilton College. And yes, I didn't just get back from an Israel trip. I ran an Israel trip about 2 months ago, almost 3 months ago actually. And it was part of a special set of trips which are called the Birthright trips. It's a group it's a group trip that was started about 12 or 15 years ago perhaps. And its goal is to bring Jewish young people from America to experience Israel firsthand so they can better understand what Israel is and from a firsthand perspective, and hopefully also like Israel, because much of what we get about Israel is not as we should as Jews, but rather from the media and other things like that. So it really walks you through the historical elements of Israel, the beauty of contemporary Israel. And so I took a group of students. Actually, there were no Hamilton students on that trip. They were on other trips. But it was a fascinating and very enlightening experience where students who are from very secular backgrounds, some of them have very little Jewish sort of connection other than the fact that they are Jewish, and they sort of have this sort of epiphany when they're there. And so it's a very meaningful trip, and it's just a 10-day trip, and it's all paid for by this organization, partly funded by the State of Israel and partly funded by private donors.
That's wonderful.
It's fascinating.
If I might, you made a good point that what the view that we get of Israel in this country and probably in a lot of places is what you see in the news, and it's usually because something bad happens. Can you tell us a little bit about the country? I mean, I'm sure there's more there than sand and religious things, because if if that's what you're led to believe, there's a lot of culture, my understanding, yes, and a lot of business. Many things come from Israel, but we never hear about them. Mm-hmm. In general, what is the country like?
So I just want to say on that point that, like, I was once I was catching a cab, and the taxi driver was from Pakistan, and we spoke for a few moments, and we were talking about Pakistan, and I asked him, Pakistan, that sounds like a bit of a scary place. And we were talking, and he goes, well, actually, it's a pretty normal place, and it's really developing, and it's, and I don't know what actually goes on there, but the way that he described it, he goes and comes, and it's a very fine place. He lives here because he wants to make a better living and a better life. And so what I learned was this is a true point everywhere. You're only going to hear the worst about everywhere, or the most dangerous. Normally about Israel, you hear about the places where there is tension. You don't hear about, say, downtown Tel Aviv, unless it is if there's a terrorist attack there, God forbid. So what goes on in Israel, when it comes to things being made in Israel, primarily Israel is a capital for R&D, research and development.
Yes.
It's called the Startup Nation. It has, I think, one of the second highest per capita of startups in the world after Silicon Valley. So it's it's unbelievable. And with exits, it has some of the highest rate of successful exits of these companies, where they get sold out and at very high costs. And so Israel's been many things that have been innovations in the past few decades have been directly from Israel, and I don't have a list offhand, but some of the most famous ones, some of them even made it onto TV shows. There's the famous rewalk, people who were completely paralyzed from the hip down and now can walk. That was something that was created by Israel. And in medicine, there's constantly new things being made. There's now even a possible that they're coming up with a vaccine for some cancers. I mean, so it definitely is ahead of its time in many things. And when it comes to security as well, Israel, American police force, many of them train in Israel.
I've heard that they go over there to learn the tactics.
And you may have seen that in Atlanta, the Black Lives Matter group there that were fighting for some reason, Israel came into their agenda, and they're now anti-Israel as well. Their cause, other than that, I'm not commenting on, but with regard to Israel, obviously I'm appalled, and they were complaining to the mayor of Atlanta, I think it was, that the Atlanta police force trains in Israel, and that's really horrible. And he basically told them, I'm not stopping that, that's a demand I cannot yield to. So, and he said, this is for our good, not for, we don't, it's not about Israel, this is about us. We need to have good training. So, the Israeli police force, the Israeli military, people always say America gives so much to Israel, and while that is true financially, Israel has been the beneficiary of a lot of great things from America, but it is a two-way street. America has gained a lot from Israeli innovation, and that is something that's out there. This is factual. This is not just.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because it's absolutely true. Did the kids that went over on the trip go over with a preconceived notion and come back with a different notion?
So I think all of them went with preconceived notions. Some were more positive, some were, negative. The majority of them liked Israel but didn't know why, were nervous about what they hear from all of their college. These were all college students or just post-college, so they've heard all the arguments against Israel. They may not be so into politics, so they don't really have a view other than the fact that they hear something negative. So it's sort of like if you hear about Saudi Arabia, you have some certain things that come to mind, whether or not you care about Saudi Arabia. And so it was the same idea. And some of them, I remember one girl got up at different points in the trip. We would do these, sort of talks, and everyone would be able to openly, express their opinions. And one girl got up towards the end, one young lady, and she said, I came because this was a free trip, but I was very nervous about coming to Israel, not because I was scared of getting killed or hurt, because that I know is not true, but I didn't want to be brainwashed, and then she said it was a very open, sort of minded trip. They couldn't say whatever they want.
Let me interrupt.
Go ahead.
She didn't want to be brainwashed.
Well, she didn't want to be led. You're being taken on a tour where you're going to be shown specific things.
Like any country, you go visit Spain. You go, kids go, and college students go. And now, I've not. It strikes me because I've interviewed people that have gone off to Spain and Germany, and they've studied in all over the place. I've never once, until right now, heard that a kid would get up and think that they were going to Israel and they were going to be brainwashed. I'm guessing that she felt there was going to be some sort of indoctrination about this is why Israel is
you make
facing the world or something. And,
right. You make a very fair point, because Israel's the only country where if you have a nice time, you've been brainwashed. And that's a true point, because when you go to Spain and you go on a guided tour, or you go to Russia, if you're a guest of the government, you're definitely going on a guided tour.
There's a place where you might think
I mean, because they have a lot of gorgeous buildings and there's a lot of beauty, but if you go blinded, if you don't know any of the politics, Russia's a very pretty place. And I did spend a little bit of time there, so I know. I'm somebody who, really studies the history of places and definitely the political climate of places. So I did see, for me, much of Europe when I was in Brussels almost 10 years ago, and I was the victim of anti-Semitic slurs all the time there, and this was before any, overt public attacks. I said to myself, to me, Europe was always a very frightening place because of what it did to Jews, and even today I felt like anti-Semitism is alive and well, and I said to myself, I don't see this place being a safe place for Jews. I'm no fortune teller, but because I'm clearly someone who looks Jewish, a religious Jew, I was subject to that. I was with my sister who obviously doesn't, she doesn't look like a bearded rabbi, so she didn't have that downside. When she was without me, she told me she was treated very nicely, and when she was with me, she got treated like this. And today we see what happens in Brussels, that the anti-Semitic attacks are now, it's not even a question anymore, and that's throughout Europe. So I don't know how I got to that, but...
I'm glad you did. If you can't, because you're intelligent, you're at a college and everything else, I've got to ask, why do you think this happens? There has to be, and I say this because there's got to be a conscious reason someplace where you would feel made unwelcome because you're Jewish. and I have never in my life, and you're one of the few people I've interviewed that I feel that I could get a straight answer out of. But you can go to a lot of countries, and because you look like an educated, like you described yourself, you look like a rabbi. And to me, the only reason you look like a rabbi is because this is what we perceive a rabbi to look like. You got a beard, you got the cap, and other than that, I could take you to New York City and you put you in the Diamond District and you look like a businessman. What is this preconceived notion that you have to go to other countries? Why is it like this so many places in the world?
Well, I can't necessarily answer that. I think, as I've read much about anti-Semitism, I think a lot of it is, it's very multi-layered, so there's many different reasons why anti-Semitism exists and what motivates anti-Semitism in different cultures, societies, and even just individuals. I must say that in Europe, when I was there, specifically in Brussels, the primary perpetrators, if you will, of the anti-Semitic slurs that were being screamed at me were from people who looked Middle Eastern. So it wasn't your Europeans, but it was many of the, I'm guessing, newly immigrants, because they didn't necessarily speak English very well, or they didn't seem like they had a Dutch or whatever, French accent. But I don't know. But so that would be sort of an Israel thing. But you have, today Israel has been very successfully demonized. The whole BDS, which is boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, which wants to get all countries and all institutions to boycott Israel, and they're very counterproductive even in their own cause, but they succeed in isolating Israel just from a philosophical point. They claim to want countries to actually isolate Israel, but not one country, well, almost not, very few countries have successfully isolated Israel beyond those that had already. So, and even in the United States, where they've got many institutions, many student bodies in universities have adopted resolutions.
I love when you open the door, Luis. There's a pervasive feeling that I will go on the record as saying I think something's mucked up in this country for I don't know how many years now. It has been a long time, but it's become noticeable that something is amiss, and I can only compare it to the mid-60s, 67, 68, 69 on college campuses when all of a sudden kids who were too young to understand Vietnam were certainly going around making all sorts of noise and boycotting and screaming and hollering. And I have noticed that even our government is less friendly, or at least is giving a cold shoulder to Israel. And you notice that because you don't hear anything on the news about getting together or helping or working together with anything. Any idea why this is happening? Is this something that's developing worldwide because there just happen to be so many nuts running so many countries, or? And that's my term. But it seems that these type of things can only happen if you get people of seemingly like mind or weak-minded people who are easily pressured. Because unless I've missed my guess, I don't recall your country doing anything in the past 10 years to take anybody off. So how does this develop? And college kids, you work at a college. Now, my daughter just went back to college, and I made it pretty clear she's got to, this year she's got to take a diversity course. And I said, well, what the heck is that? And, I'm guessing that you don't want to go in there and like in the old days, a drunk walks into a bar and tells some sort of jokes because you'll offend everybody. So she said it's a course on how people are supposed to get along. And I realized that if you've got to give courses like that there's really something the matter. So what is your feeling on your campus about how this kind of stuff comes about, disliking Israel all of a sudden, a girl going there and thinking she's going to be indoctrinated? Where the hell does this thinking come from?
Mm-hmm. So, firstly, I can't speak for Hamilton. I don't work
for
Hamilton.
I mean,
I'm an unofficial, in an unofficial role. I work with many students at Hamilton, so I get an idea.
It's your feeling from being around.
From being generally on the college scene, I'll say, and I'm very well connected with many Chabads at different colleges. We're a very tight network of about 200 college campuses in America, a little more. And again, it is complicated. I would say the general college, culture is one of social action, helping the underdog and that kind of thing. Israel, because of, thank God, its strength, Israel is not perceived the underdog anymore. It was until, say, 1967. And today, Israel is no longer the underdog. The Palestinian who lives in refugee camps is the underdog. And I don't necessarily dispute that fact. It's a hard life for a refugee who lives in a refugee camp. The problem is the average person doesn't want to look back at the very near history. I'm not talking about 100 years ago, which is important too, but even 60 years ago, the very near history, where the recent history shows that the Palestinians had opportunities, the Palestinian leadership a number of times, and to advance peace, or even just not to kill, and they chose otherwise. And so, yes, they are in a dire situation, and it is sad. No one can dispute that. But when something bad happens, when a border policeman, an Israeli border policeman, has to turn away a family and to go back to Gaza, that doesn't mean he's being evil. That's following a policy so that Jews in Israel and non-Jews, many Muslims, some even Arabs, can be safe. And that's just what you do if you have a country. And that's something that's a very sad situation that came about because of the Palestinian leadership from the beginning, from really the 1900s, but even from the 1940s, where they were going to have two states, and then every time there was a possibility for peace, they didn't want it. And then you have the UN, which has played a very sad role in just continuing to perpetuate the refugee problem by making them stay refugees, not even trying to absorb any of them into nearby countries. And it must be noted that anywhere else where Palestinians, refugees, have gone to, say Lebanon, Jordan, anywhere else, they've been treated as second-class citizens too. But you don't have any boycott, divestment. And not in Israel, they're not second-class citizens because they're not citizens. The ones that don't live in Israel, they live in the West Bank or Gaza. But I'm saying anywhere else where they did go, they weren't absorbed either, and they weren't. There's still a refugee problem there, and it's fascinating.
They have no identity, really,
which is sad, and it's something that needs to be fixed up. But when you ask yourself, why is Israel, just to give you a very simple example, before 1967, when Israel did capture the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinians did not have the West Bank and Gaza. Gaza was Egypt's, West Bank was Jordan's, the Golan was Syria, and Lebanon had the upper. No one complained about that. Once Israel captured it, it was about giving it back to the Palestinians. But there was, the Palestinians didn't actually rule it until then. But I do understand they need a place, but you have to be realistic. You have to be fair to Israeli concerns. I don't think... and I think that much of the complexities and the nuances are just not important and not relevant to the average person because it doesn't affect their family. I have family that lives there, so I care, and I can understand why a Palestinian who has family that lives anywhere in that area is going to be passionate on the other side. But a regular college student is not really going to think too much. They're going to look at who looks sad and which situation looks okay, and Israel just seems strong enough.
If this is an unfair question, just tell me. But where does this BS? I can't. FCC would get nervous if I. But this had to start someplace in the past 4 or 5 years. There was a wonderful, as far as when I was a kid, had been a great relationship with Israel. And it's funny how we've got to talk like this. I mean, to me, Israel is sort of like, it's like Canada. It's there, and there's never been a problem with it. We didn't fight. We didn't, there was Israel. And now all of a sudden, the past 5, 6, 8 years, there's a tense feeling where people feel better not supporting Israel or speaking out against Israel. Where did that start? Was it all of a sudden something that happened in Palestine or something? Is it because Yasser Arafat died, or was he the glue holding together a very shaky? Was he the bad guy that everybody could look at as a bad guy? Something is much different, and it had to start someplace. Now, the UN has always been a goofy institution. putting so many countries that don't get along together and making them get along doesn't work. But what is this picking on Israel thing now?
Well, I think that the BDS movement actually succeeded in marginalizing Israel. I think that a lot of it has to do with how people perceive Israel. You have to think about it like this. 10% of the population, let's say, I'm just making up statistics, 10% would be pro-Israel because they're Jews or because they have family there, whatever. 10% are going to be anti-Israel no matter what because they
haven't got it. They really don't.
Well, no, let's say those 10% who do have family or some feelings, the 80% are more, they're apathetic. They don't have any reason to go either way. And when you show them enough photos of a desperate situation in Palestine, that's going to frame the conversation. And so that's what I think why it's so easily to persuade them. And to me, quite frankly, it makes me very... I'm very slow to believe anything on the news just because I know that the photos in a refugee camp can look very sad. And I can watch a BBC report and it looks very sad, but I know what the story is, and I know how things can be exaggerated. And like the simple examples are the Gaza war. When people say, well, look what's going on, the destruction in Gaza. And sometimes the things are exaggerated, obviously. Sometimes they're not true. But even when they are true, you have to ask yourself, what are Israel's options? What is Israel supposed to do? Is Israel not supposed to fight back because it's worried that one person might die and therefore just allow hundreds of rockets to fall on its cities where people have to literally move, where my sister had to move from Kiryat Gat, which is in the south of Israel, not too far from Beersheba, and she was hearing rockets from her house, which is it's not a border town, and is that the way they should live? And they shouldn't respond because, God forbid, they should hit anyone and then, suffer the repudiation of the entire world. So I think that a lot of it has to do with that perception, and Israelis suffer from that. I think part of it is an old anti-Semitism, which we just can't change. People hold Israel to a higher standard than any other country in the world. And I think that at the end of the day, we have to fight for just equality, being treated equal under the law, which Israel is not at this time, I don't believe.
No, and especially now. We have lots of time left, but Rick had given me this, and I wanted to talk about the courses that you're giving up at Hamilton.
Well, I'm actually giving this to the wider community. It's open to all, and it's also open specifically to lawyers. Well, it's open to everyone, but it still has CLE credits pending.
Really?
Well, it's still pending. The state has to approve them, but from what I understand, they will be approved.
Something interesting that you can get continuing education credits
yes,
for.
Yes, you can get continuing education credits for, and it's basically a discussion, a very controversial discussion, which is always exciting, and it's called, the course is Elections 2016, What Does Judaism Say? And it's a non-partisan discussion, but it is completely rooted.
How are you going to pull that one off?
So it is fascinating because it's what's fascinating about the course is it goes through, this particular part of the course is two parts, and it goes through immigration and gun control, which I think are the two most hot button issues for now. There are other issues which I discussed in a possibly what we will offer later. We're doing this in conjunction with the Utica Jewish Community Center, the JCC, and I will be presenting the course together with an attorney, Eva Perlman. So that will be, and she'll be presenting some of the legal aspects. But really, what it goes through is presenting the current, situation, argument on some of these key issues, and then really looking at it from a Jewish perspective. What I mean by Jewish perspective is looking at Jewish texts. It's purely academic, and seeing how Judaism 2,000 years ago would have viewed some of these arguments, and how we can learn from that. And what ends up coming out is that you can really prove whatever you want, but you can see how sages 2,000 years ago would have thought about gun control, which is to me quite fascinating, because you see some of the arguments that people have today, and really it's all true. People on one side will say, well, if we don't have guns, what's going to stop wouldn't that have helped the Jews in the 30s in Germany? But then you have people on the other side saying, well, if you have guns everywhere, that's just a bad society. And you see this exact argument, not with guns, but with other dangerous items, even knives and spears, that the rabbis argued about what people should and shouldn't keep in their homes, where, and it really depends on the geography of where you live, because if you live in a very populated area, if you don't, and all of this is discussed, and I think that everybody can gain from this. It's not going to change anybody's opinion. It might, but it's not geared to do that. It's really geared to get people to discuss and just let them take a more Torah view. Why is that important? Because I think that much of the argument today is completely polarized. You have an opinion.
Really?
but it's even extreme, and we all become more extreme than we really are. So we once did this wonderful exercise with teens when I lived in Florida. We did this exercise where we asked students to write down on a piece of paper whether they were pro-life or pro-choice, and everyone wrote on a piece of paper. Then they folded the paper, and then we gave them 5 different situations, cases, and we asked them to write what they would rule in each of those cases. So a woman wanted to have a child. She was all excited, looking forward, and then she decided 8 months in that she doesn't want to have a child anymore. What do you think she should be allowed to have an abortion? One woman was raped. You have all 5, and then you have those are 2 extremes, and then you have more, regular cases. And what was fascinating is I don't believe there was one teen who followed through with their position 100% of the way. So if you were pro-choice, you didn't believe in all 5 cases that she should be allowed to have an abortion. And none of them believed. This was teens, so you could argue otherwise. And if you were pro-choice, if you were pro-life, you didn't believe in all 5 cases that she should not be allowed to have an abortion. And what that showed them was, and there may have been 1 or 2 that just, followed through with their opinions all the way through. But the point was that it's much more complicated than that. And it's not popular today, and it's hard to be elected as a politician if you have, because you're going to upset both sides if you have an opinion that goes either way. But that's really how it should be.
Do you think that part of the big problem, I'm going to ask you the question, and I've got a hard opinion on this, that one of the main problems is that we aren't allowed to discuss things anymore. You have to take a position. You are, and as soon as you said we wanted the kids to write on a piece of paper whether they're pro-choice or pro-life, it makes you have to go boom, boom. Then you're giving them the scenarios and making them think. And I noticed that whether it's gun control or abortion or immigration I can't even think of the old days when you worked on a political campaign that it was probably something dumb like a subway stop or getting something somewhere in your neighborhood. Everything now has got to be either or. Is that making it harder to do something like this where you want people's opinions, but you know darn well there's no discussion in between anymore, it seems. Everything turns into an argument.
So I think when you remove the parties from it, the partisanship and the parties, the candidates, when you just talk about the issues, I believe you can have a much more open discussion.
But kids are coming into college already with these preconceived notions.
Again, this course is primarily for people in the community.
Oh.
I may offer it for college students. I have a different course for college students, not politically, not politically swaying. But I find that when I talk with students, I don't really try to convince students of political views, but when I do talk with students and politics comes out, most of them are very reasonable. I would say all of the ones that I saw are very reasonable. They're fair-minded. They might have very extreme views, but they can understand when they're not in that, sort of, when people are not part of a mob mentality or, when
as individuals, maybe in a class.
Everyone, and we all fall into, I don't think this is a student problem. This is, we as Americans today are very much feel that we need to fall into one category. And what I think is cool about this elections at this time is the growth and the picking up speed of the Libertarian Party. It hasn't made it to a third party that's even, but if he gets to 15%, Gary Johnson will be in the debates. I think that's pretty awesome. I don't know who I want to win. I just think that that's what America needs, to know that you're allowed to, and he's really a mix of both opinions. He calls himself the best of both parties. That's for everyone to decide. But I just think the concept of being able to pick and choose, like when people say, "Oh, if you're pro-life, you must be pro-gun."
Oh, sure, yeah, that's exactly what. Yeah.
And I think that's not true. That we should be able to, and even within each argument, you could be pro-life and yet be okay with abortions. You should be pro-guns and yet be okay with.
You used to be able to have a variety of opinions, and now I watch as kids are younger and younger, not having a variety of opinions, and that's why I asked. It's either or.
Right.
I mean, you've even had my daughter pose questions to me that way, which normally would be, Daddy, how did you ever, what did you think when you were a kid or something? It's more of they come back with a question about something that a kid who's 19 really wouldn't even know about, but boom, because this is the way news is presented on television, and Rick and I talk about these things during the course of a day. Everything is in your face and either or. Rick, go ahead.
Yes, it's great to have you back on the air with us. And as I always say, it's great to have you here, and
I want to make sure we get information on this.
Make sure we get the course on the air once more before you go. I wanted to ask you something, though, Rabbi, about Benjamin Netanyahu, and you don't have to get too political. But I've done a lot of reading, and I go to some of the newspapers in Israel, and every time somebody pops up and says he's wonderful for Israel, great for the country, somebody else pops up and says no, he isn't, that he's caused a lot of trouble in the area. What is your take on Benjamin Netanyahu? Do you think he is what Israel needs at this point in time?
A very good question. I don't want to get too political.
And I understand.
I usually err with allowing my political
maybe observations more so
right.
than
So
opinions.
I think that Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu, by extension, has a right to be assertive. I think that he has been quite assertive in the public forum, and I think that that's important to make it clear that Israel is not disappearing, that Israel is going to exist. But I mean, no buts. I mean, he's been unapologetic about Israel's right to defend itself, and I think that is something that it's allowed to do. The fact is, today, and if you read some of the great newspapers, you'll see this. The Jerusalem Post has reported about this, and others.
Right.
There is now covert talks between Israel and some of Israel's perceived hostile neighbors. This past week, or the week before, Egypt's foreign minister visited Israel. And this hasn't made worldwide news. I don't know why. Maybe it's a good thing so that they don't get too nervous. He then went back and argued with a student, a high school student or a student, I don't remember, about Israel having real fair concerns with its security and not being an oppressive place. I mean, that's unheard of for an elected official in Egypt to argue with a high school student or with a student about that. So there's definitely a change, and there's an amazing diplomat in Israel whose name is Dori Gold, and he is really working on these secret relationships. And while, for instance, when the Iran deal was being argued, so being deliberated, he said that many countries in that area are now turning to Israel for guidance or advice, and or also for support. And these are the same countries that in the public domain will probably say negative things about Israel. Countries even like Saudi Arabia. And so these alliances, these unlikely alliances, can be built up actually more because of Netanyahu's strong stance. If Israel was weak, these countries, just like in 1950, would just come and attack Israel again. But because it's strong and they know Israel is not going anywhere, they are maybe not looking for peace, because that's not good from a philosophical perspective for some of them, but at least for coexistence. But it could be good for them in the long run if they got over the hurdles, and hopefully one day they will. But for now, that's how it is, and I think he's doing a lot of great things in that way. Whether or not he's an effective leader, I mean, I'll let the Israelis decide that.
Right, I know that, and I'm a huge right.
They picked him, and you go with him until
I'm a big supporter of Benjamin Netanyahu. He is one of, in quotes, a hero of mine on the international stage. Not that my opinion means anything, because it doesn't.
Why not?
But I'm very supportive of him. I'll be honest with you. I think that if I had to choose 3 or 4 of the most important leaders in the world right now, I think I would probably put him on the list. And in my opinion, deservedly so. But I understand where other people are coming to. We get their different opinions, and there's other leadership in Israel that has some different ideas. Before we run out of time, we need to go back over your course.
I wanted to give the information, because we've got about a minute left. 381-3491.
315. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Sorry.
381-3491 for information on the 2-part course.
Yes.
Part 1, September 7th. Part 2, September 21st. 12:30. Now it says Utica JCC or. So which?
Well, no, it's at Utica JCC, but I don't have the number for them offhand, because they can be called as well.
Okay, so
or they can call Chabad, which is the number that you just gave, and it's on both on Wednesdays at 12:30, and they can also come at 12:15 for a complimentary luncheon before.
Right, and anybody who wants to get in touch with you, if you can get in touch with us here at the radio station, I'll be happy to put them.
I'll put
Perfect, and we'll get them in touch with you.
Great.
Rabbi Didiwax, I really appreciate you coming in. You're always very, very informative and blunt, and answer the questions, and not blunt in a bad way. You see blunt nowadays, they say, "Oh my God!" It's just that I can ask you and get an answer. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Rick and I want to say thank you for being here this week. We'll be back on Monday, 6 o'clock.
With experiments and unneeded equipment. A Pacific splashdown is coming up in just under 3 hours. S&P futures are